All right. Okay, good morning and welcome. I have turned off my mobile phone, but I'm not able to turn off my office phone. So if it does go, I'm just going to put the phone down and we'll just ignore it. So I'm here to talk to you for half an hour on cognitive load theory and methods of instruction. There is a diagram on the screen that you're going to see a few times, and I'm going to be talking about it in a few slides' time. As Gronya has said, she will be sending around recordings, and you have on the screen my email address. So if there is anything that you want to ask me about, do feel free to email me. Okay, so cognitive load, it's a term that started to become a lot more popular. A lot of people are using this term, mainly in educational circles, but actually also I'm hearing this outside of educational circles. And it is a term that has been used for some time now. As you can see from what I've just put up on the board, perhaps it gained most traction when Dylan Wiliam, who is perhaps best known originally for his work on Inside the Black Box and all sorts of formative assessment and assessment in general, tweeted the quote that we've got here, that he considered it to be the single most important thing for teachers to know. Now, there is some debate as to whether he is correct, but I would say to you, and I hope by the end of this half hour, if you don't know much about cognitive load, that even if it's not the most important thing, it certainly is one of the most important things, because if we don't understand what we are expecting students to be doing and the pressure we're putting them under, actually we're not supporting the way in which they are learning any subject, whether it's classics or otherwise. So just give you a minute to read this second paragraph. So if we think about a physical load, we know that if we're carrying too much, it's too much of a burden. We might drop it. We might do ourselves some injury. Well, the cognitive load is exactly the same. It's the load that we're putting on our memories, the load we're putting on our brains. And of course, if we overload somebody in any way, then it's not going to be successful. And we need to consider cognitive load, I think, not only for students, but actually we need to consider cognitive load theory for us as educators, because we all know that when we're teaching in a classroom, a teacher is having to multitask all the way through. And if we consider the things that I'm going to be talking about in this session for ourselves as well as our own students, we are more likely to be able to deliver effectively what we want students to hear and to understand. So you'll see that I've put some of the articles, some of the details in the presentation. And again, you should be able to access these when you get the recording. But if you're having difficulty with that, please just email me. Now, the article is from the Chartered College. I'm a member of the Chartered College, so it may be you're not able to access this. So again, just let me know if you can't. So rather than listening to me, I've got a few clips, YouTube clips, that explain what cognitive load is about.
We've got 4 videos in this little series on cognitive load theory. Watch them all to get a better understanding. Cognitive load theory tries to describe how the human mind processes new information. We have a very limited capacity for dealing with new information, anywhere from 3 to 7 elements. This is particularly tricky if the elements are interactive. Element interactivity means the degree to which the parts of knowledge have to be learnt together to make sense. For example, learning words in a foreign language has low interactivity. You can learn one at a time. Learning to drive has high interactivity because you need to process knowledge about changing gears, looking for traffic, maintaining road position all at once until some become automated. If a learning situation presents material in which we have to process too much at once, we experience cognitive overload. Cognitive overload impairs or prevents learning, so we as teachers need to avoid this condition in our students. We do this by designing instructional materials and activities that avoid exceeding our students' available capacity for working with new knowledge. Watch the next video to learn about the difference between long-term and working memory.
Okay, so rather than watching the next video, let's just think a little bit more about what's just been said. So there are three main components to our memory system, and what you've got on this screen is rather a nice simplified drawing of what I'm about to refer to. So we start off with the environment, so an unlimited store of information. And as teachers, we are making decisions daily, every lesson and every part of every lesson, as to exactly what elements of the environment, of the teaching, the educational environment, we're going to provide for our students. Now, it is unlimited, so we have to make those choices. And what we're needing to do, first of all, is we need to ensure that all our students are fully attentive to what we're trying to teach them. Because all the research has been telling us, and of course we know this anyway as teachers, but if you're not fully attentive, then you're actually not going to be able to take in the information fully to start with. And if you don't have that initial knowledge, then you're not going to be able to work on the information and turn it into your long-term memory. So students, first of all, need to be attentive. Assuming they're attentive, these students then are bringing that information into their working memory. And as we've just been told, we have an incredibly limited working memory, 3 to 7, as we were told, facts. Now you can group those, so it could be 3 groups, it could be 7 groups, but it's still incredibly limited. And our job is to move from the working memory to the long-term memory. And we're pretty certain that our long-term memory, unlike our working memory, is almost unlimited. I know often we will hear ourselves or other people say, oh, I don't know where that fact came from. When suddenly in the middle of a quiz, you come up with a thought, or in the middle of a conversation, it reminds you of something that maybe you haven't thought about, if you're somebody like me, for 20, 30, 40 or so more years. Well, that will be because for whatever reason, your working memory has processed the details and turned it into long-term memory. Okay, so from memory then to mastery. And obviously this is what we're doing as educators. We want children to understand the information first of all, so they need to hear it, they need to understand it, and then of course they need to remember it, and then they're going to be able to use it. And we have these two cognitive scientists, Dan Willingham, who I'll be referring to a little bit later on, and Robert Bjork, who've been thinking about this issue of how memory works for several decades. And both of their work is absolutely fascinating and fundamental, I would say, to how I have changed my teaching over the last decade. I'll give you a minute just to read the next paragraph. So I've put in red and in capital letters, carefully and repeatedly. Long gone are those days when I observe people teaching and I ask them about something that they're making an assumption that the children have already covered. And I ask them after the lesson, how do you know that children have understood it? Often if I'm observing a subject other than classics and I genuinely don't understand the subject matter. Long gone are the days when a teacher feels they can say to me, because I've taught it to them. We know that teaching children obviously is our start point. However, we cannot assume that just because we've taught something that they're going to remember it, because we've got to make that memory stick so it doesn't slip away. So carefully to begin with, and then deliberately and repeatedly therein. So just a minute for you to read this final paragraph. Now, I think we know that children have priorities. If we think about what they're doing outside the classroom, I think about when my daughter was younger and how well she knew the lyrics of particular songs. She may not have known certain things in her maths lesson as successfully because she chose to be listening and to be recalling those lyrics. And we need to recognize that what our students are thinking about most carefully is what they will remember. And so we need to be very deliberate about what we are prioritizing in our lessons. And sometimes we can forget and bring things in that we think will maintain their motivation that actually detract from their real focus on the things that we want them to understand. So one way of thinking about working memory is to consider it, and we've got an image coming up, as like the bottleneck of our thinking. So if we think then about the new information and the tasks coming into that bottle, the first thing they have to do is to get through that narrow bottleneck before they can go into the much wider and more welcoming part of the bottle, which is our long-term memory. And it's how to get through that initial difficult phase that we need to focus on. So if we bear that in mind, then we need to consider what's going to affect students' working memory. Well, first of all, distractions. So I've got my window shut to avoid you hearing any distractions, but outside my window, I can hear students who are in a PE lesson outside. And if any of us is in a classroom and there's a PE lesson outside and the windows are open and they can actually see the students, we know that they're distracted. And so we need to try and avoid all of those distractions in our lessons. And so, for example, we need to consider for possibly removing any posters at the front of the classroom so that students aren't looking at those when they should be looking at the board or looking at us. Too much information. What I've tried to do with this presentation is to pare down the details that I'm providing for you. And I'm trying to give you images that only support rather than detract from the information that I'm giving you. We need to consider the demand of a task, because if it's too difficult, then students are likely to switch off. And we need to consider students' emotional states. Now, sometimes we can't do anything about that if something has just happened to a student, but sometimes we know the usefulness of a do now task, as they're popularly called, can't say that word. We need to consider maybe the first task in our classroom to remove students from whatever was happening previously. We need to calm them down and we need to get them emotionally and cognitively ready for our classroom and our learning. And finally, we need to consider the familiarity, I really can't speak today, familiarity of the language that we are using. And we need to bear in mind that if we are using new vocabulary or additional language, we are providing an additional burden to students. And this is why when we have our students who don't do much reading or don't understand some of the language that we are using, that they start at a disadvantage. Okay, so if we have a look at these as an example, and this is taken from Daniel Willingham's Why Don't Students Like School? Now, I'm not going to give you this task. It's a little bit difficult to do this online, because if I was doing it in front of you, I'd then blank it. I'd give you a minute. I'd get you to write it down. But if you have a look at that, some of you may have fantastic photographic memories. My father did. I always thought it was very unfair. I certainly do not. But there are ways of grouping these letters that would make it much easier to remember, such as this. Now, those X's at the top and the bottom, they're very easy. CNN, PhD, FBI, CIA. I think we can tell that Daniel Willingham comes from America. Now, this NCAA is some athletics association, which means nothing to me because I'm not American and because I don't understand that sport. If I just had all of the rest of this, my cultural understanding would enable me to interpret those letters and help me to remember the information. And that's what we need to do. We need to find triggers. We need to find hooks with the knowledge that we're providing our students with. So we cannot make assumptions about their prior knowledge. Is it culturally specific? Is it vocabulary specific? So we need not to make assumptions, but to deliberately make those links when we're providing them with that information. So our second clip.
Cognitive load theory proposes that while we have a very limited working memory, able to deal with only 3 to 7 elements at once, we have an effectively infinite long-term memory. Our limited processing capacity only applies to novel or new information, so the more that we have stored or automated in our infinite long-term memory, the easier tasks will feel. This is the feeling of competence or expertise. This makes sense. When we learn to read as children, we sound out words looking at each individual letter in very short words. Each letter is another element. As we start automating that process, meaning we hold the shape of words in our long-term memory, we read whole words, putting them together to create sentences. Eventually, we know so much about a topic that we can put sentences together to create conceptual meaning. Imagine two children learning about the food chain in the Serengeti. Child A has never been exposed to African animal names, whilst Child B has grown up hearing stories about African animals and can easily imagine each when named. They're in her long-term memory. While learning, Child A might become overwhelmed by the high interactivity of new knowledge presented in the food chain, given she's simultaneously trying to process the names of the new animals and their interactions. Child B already possesses a schema of knowledge about the animals, so only needs to concentrate on the interactions in the food chain, a much simpler task. Our job as teachers is to ensure that our students have enough long-term memory, or prior knowledge, so that whatever we're presenting does not exceed their working memory processing capacity. This is where pre-testing and spaced practice can help. Watch the next video to discover the 3 types of cognitive load and what we can do to optimize instruction.
Well, guess what? We're not going to watch the next one. I apologise. You can look at those on YouTube. However, let's go back to that image that I showed you in the first couple of clips. So you should by now have understood what we're dealing with initially. This is our intrinsic load. Okay, so this is the information that we want to provide for students. And what we want to do is we want to decrease, get rid of all the distractions, all the anomalies that might prevent students from taking on board the information that we want them to gain. And this germane load, so this is the third part of the triangle for cognitive load theory, is one that's slightly disputed, but basically this is how we enable the intrinsic load to become established for our learner. So I'll just give you a minute to read this. So it's the effort, the thought that goes into the management of that intrinsic load. And that's very much down to us as teachers. So think about what we can be doing for each of these stages. We need to reduce the amount that the students are taking in at once. That's managing the intrinsic load. We need to consider how we enable the students to process the information and how we get rid of the extraneous load that might distract them from the details. So really, the reason I'm starting with this session is because everything else that's being said today needs to have this concept as part of how we deliver the material, whether it's about our grammar acquisition, whether it's translations, whether it's all aspects of our subject. So reducing extraneous load then. Get rid of redundant information. What is it on a Google slide, a PowerPoint presentation that you don't need? What is it in your explanation that might confuse rather than clarify? Try not to split students' attention, talking about something that maybe was 5 pages earlier in a textbook and they have to look back on it. Or if you're providing them with a slide, are those images in the right place or a diagram in the right place so the children aren't having to move their eyes from one side of the screen or the other? Get rid of transient information. There's a hyperlink here. So again, if any of you wants to email me, I'll send you the link to this, which is a nice article which InnerDrive put together about transient information, which is information that doesn't stay. So this is when we are verbalizing instructions without backing them up with something, for example, written on a whiteboard behind us. We want to optimize our intrinsic load. So pre-teaching. So this is where we don't make assumptions of what children already know. We either deliberately teach it, or it's something that we check as a homework, the pre-testing, before we go into our follow-up activities. Rather than providing huge amounts of information at once, we should segment or chunk the information that we're providing students. And that links very much with keeping things as simple as possible. That's not dumbing down, that is simplifying, talking about things in layers so that we build up students' competence and confidence. So recommendations then. So the worked example effect, providing students, as it says, with a step-by-step example, modelling the steps that you want them to take. So if it's a series of translation sentences, are we doing the first one initially? And then are we doing it with the students before we ask them to do it on their own? The I, the you, or the I, the we, and then the you approach is one way that some people talk about this. I think this is a really interesting one. Most of us will have a mixed ability classroom. The reality is that even if you teach in a set, when you've got a group of more than one person, it's going to be mixed ability. And within that, you've got a range of learners. And actually, the more expert the learners, the more you should expect them to problem solve without worked examples, because sometimes that can actually confuse them if they've already got their way of working sorted out. And that's where sometimes it might be that if you're giving instructions, you might give those detailed instructions to one group of students where the others in the class are being asked to get on with the work themselves. The redundancy effect. Too often we can put too much information on our PowerPoint slides. Too often we can try and make pages of work pretty. Too often we can add extra details. Try not to overwhelm students. As I said, the split attention effect. Don't ask students to process more than one source of information at once. You've heard me try to separate out you reading information by giving you a little bit of processing time, and then I'm talking about it. Because generally, we talk at a different rate than people read. So if you try and read over people trying to read it themselves, that can cause some difficulties. Now, 4 and 5 seem a little bit contradictory. It is important to back up what you are saying with what you are writing, but the aim is that you are trying to do those so that they support rather than confuse each other. So you need to think about the timing for both of those. And the second set of recommendations really goes back to what I've said before, not including necessary information on slides. I've just referred to students having reading time, thought processing time. When we teach, we often say things very quickly, partly because we're the experts, and there's the curse of knowledge, isn't there? Because we know it really well, we think it's straightforward. But also, it may not just be that we know it really well, but maybe we've taught that lesson 3 times already that day. So we speed up because we know what we're talking about. Whereas for the students, it's the first time. Or if it's the second time, we're wanting them to think about what we said the first time and to remember it. New vocabulary needs to be repeated frequently. You cannot repeat it often enough. Talked about reducing distractions. When you are teaching, and we all do this in a lesson, what is it that's the most important thing that we want the students to get out of that task of that lesson? So consider first what you want the students to get out of it, then make that accessible. Absolutely fine to create something that involves creativity. That's lovely. But quite often, the more creative and the more exciting the task, the less they'll remember the purpose of that task and more how much they enjoyed making that cake or whatever else it was. Okay, so that's all I wanted to say. I've got to the end of my slides. I've got 5 minutes left, so I'm going to stop sharing now. And I don't know, Gronya, if there was anything in the chat that you wanted me to go over.
Thanks, Julie. We haven't had any questions as yet, but given that we have got a couple of minutes before our next presentation, if anybody does have any comments or anything that they'd like to ask Julie, now is your opportunity to do so. You don't have to use the chat, you can just unmute and speak to us. Holly.
Yeah, could I? Sorry, my window's open. I'll close that. I wanted to see if there was any link. So I'm ADHD and I've done a lot of work on that because we have just less cognitive everything at any given time because it takes so much extra effort. Is it a similar idea to the idea that there was you have, say, a set amount of money and each activity is worth different money, and then you have to kind of work out what you is it similar to that theory where you've only got a set amount and you kind of have to choose what you're going to spend it on, except for we're choosing for the students?
Yeah, in many ways. So if you know you have a lot of money that you're doling out, if you've got a lot of information that you're needing to provide students with, you need to decide how much they are going to be able to take on board at any one time and to separate out those elements, excuse me, completely. And I think that often teachers will say, I've got so much of the curriculum to get through, so I need to rattle through it. Well, the reality is that you can rattle through it, but if the children haven't understood what you have said initially, then there was no point in going through it quickly. And my view is always just keep repeating things that you have said already. Gronya will know when she was at Noah Hill that actually that repetition, that testing, all of that is something that will enable you, however short of time you are, will enable you to get in that information to children because you're constantly returning to it. And I think that if you teach something once and then you're teaching it again a week later, you don't have to take as long over it the next time and then the third time. I think that I just saw coming up in the chat about, teaching in reduced time. I think it's the principles are exactly the same, however much time you have. Just keep returning to what you've initially taught, but don't try to reteach, retest it. And that perhaps would be the one thing that I would say. So all the research that I've done says the reteaching isn't anywhere near as useful as the retesting. Teach it, test it again. Keep checking it, keep asking the students, but keep going back over it. But doing it in chunks is what's important.
Thank you.
Hi, I don't know if you can hear me.
Hi, Poppy. Yeah.
Sorry. Oh, I was just wondering what your views are on the pre-teaching element being kind of contained within displays in the classroom. Is less more in that case as well?
Yes, I think again at my school we've changed quite dramatically how we use displays in the classroom, and we certainly try to encourage teachers to have a completely clear board at the front, so not a single display at the front of the classroom. Sometimes it is useful to have displays because you can point to those displays. And so again, when you're thinking about the duality of presenting information, you're talking about something, you point to that display at the side of the classroom, that then can be really useful and the children can be used then to turning to it. And I think that's really helpful. As long as then what you're not doing is having that classroom display that's preventing students from genuinely testing their knowledge because they can always look at it. And again, I think that can be slightly problematic, and that's where perhaps in terms of those displays, maybe those are slides that can keep coming back to your classroom presentation as opposed to displays that the children are always staring at, because the children, just like adults, we don't want to get things wrong. So we cheat. All of us cheat. You know, we do as adults, we do as children, and we want to do well. We want to please our teacher, you know, if we're a student, and we want to please ourselves. And so we look to find the answers. And actually one of the best things you can do as a teacher is not to start every revision session with children writing down what they know now. So it's that recall activity without looking anything up. Once they've written down what they know now, then they can check in their books, then they can look at that display on the wall. And we've had some times where we've got lovely displays on our wall that actually we just cover over periodically because we don't want them to be used. We can then uncover them, big reveal, when we use them.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you ever so much, Julie. That was so informative and so useful. And I've heard you talk about cognitive load so many times, and it influenced my teaching hugely. But it's always brilliant for that refresher. So I will